It's Sunday, December 1, 2024. I'm Anthony Davis. Welcome to the Weekend Show, where we make the time to consider the news of the week. You can support my work and independent journalism at patreon.com/5minutenews. Our guest today is a political analyst and author of the books American Rule, How a Nation Conquered the World but Failed Its People, and The Midnight Kingdom, A History of Power, Paranoia, and the Coming Crisis. Jared Yates Sexton, welcome back to the Weekend Show.
Anthony, my friend, always a pleasure.
And happy Thanksgiving. I should probably start with that.
Happy Thanksgiving. I'm thankful for you. I'm thankful that you're out there doing the work.
And likewise. And I immerse myself in your writings and in your blogs. And I think maybe we should start with that because I don't know if you're aware, but Donald Trump won the election. And a lot of us, including myself, failed to see that coming. And I've apologized publicly to my followers that journalism does not necessarily always extend to a successful prediction. And many pollsters are saying the same thing. But 312 to 226, he's claiming it was a landslide and a mandate. Well, the popular vote is suggesting that that's now not the case. He didn't quite reach 50%. Did you see this coming?
Unfortunately, I learned my lesson in 2016. I cut my teeth covering the beginnings of the MAGA movement and Trump's campaigning back then. And I believed at that point that someone as repugnant and as repulsive and as inept as him could never become president. I learned my lesson from that. I was incredibly disappointed. It actually took a very long time. American Rule, I actually had to write in order to come to understand how that was even possible. I had to disabuse myself of a lot of conventional narratives in history that I had come to believe. I thought it was a very good possibility that he was going to win this time around for a variety of reasons that I'm sure that we'll probably end up discussing. I didn't want to believe it was true. It was a difference between the brain and the heart. My heart wanted to believe that he would be roundly rejected and maybe we could possibly move forward and figure something else out. But yes, I thought it was a very good possibility he would win.
I think maybe that's where I went wrong, was that I was led by my heart and my trust in the American people to do the right thing. But when we look to history, as we tried to in the predictions and the run up to the election, we were always referencing the kind of early Nazi rule, because obviously Adolf Hitler didn't go straight to gas chambers, did he? I mean, this is what people tended to forget and why people were angry with those of us who compared Trump to Hitler. The Holocaust was far later, after he was duly elected. And so, this is the thing about history, isn't it? That we need to recognize that whilst there are similarities, and a lot of people talk about history as being cyclical, we find ourselves in a very familiar situation now, don't we?
We do. And, it is about cycles. And I would invite people listening and watching to think about the cycles in their own lives, the way that things continually happen in a very similar manner. Right? And there are moments of clarity, moments where you start to realize how things have repeated and how these cycles have continued to play out. In terms of American politics, and I assume there are people listening around the world, particularly in liberal democracies such as Germany, France, the United Kingdom, you name it, I would invite all of those people to take a look at this and use it as a point of clarity. It's useful as a rock bottom. And I was saying this the other day, a rock bottom is only a rock bottom if you stop, right? If you don't fall through to the next layer of the rock bottom. And this should be a moment of clarity to understand what America is, what America has always been, and to make a different choice, to start interacting with this, to start behaving differently, and to start moving in a different direction that clarity affords.
And this is a very interesting point of contention, because now there is some rhetoric that, well, journalists and the media need to wake up and start covering America through the eyes of MAGA Republicans because they have as much a voice as the kind of neoliberal movement. And that, maybe people have been ignoring the fact that there is this kind of large swathe of people who are vehemently anti-immigration, vehemently anti-trans, anti-LGBTQ+, who are pro-evangelical Christianity, and that they deserve equal billing in the media landscape.
Yeah, I think that's a flawed framing.
I'm pleased you said that.
When you talk about, I'll use an example, right? Like when you cover anti-vaccine rhetoric, right? Conspiracy theories based on those things. You don't cover it as fact. You don't take these outrageous and hateful claims and then treat them with the equal respect of the other side, which of course is the rule of science and fact and empirical data. What you need to do is to actually investigate what those are expressions of. So, for instance, when it comes to anti-vax, of course, it's a distrust of elites, which I'm sorry, but elites have earned our distrust to a large degree. It's a distrust of things like big pharma. And we all know that big pharma deserves distrust to a great extent. So in this case, instead of talking about these lashing outs of MAGA Republicans and the MAGA base, start looking at what's underneath it. And people have said to me, we both know that MSNBC is in quite a bit of trouble right now. And people have asked me, what should MSNBC have done differently? And whenever I've answered, it's not been a popular answer. It's, well, we're constantly talking about Donald Trump's lawsuits. We're talking about the outrageous things that he's doing. Talk about the material conditions that led to him being able to capitalize on it. We need to talk about the crisis in education. We need to talk about economic precarity. We need to talk about what it actually feels like in the United States of America for an average person to live. You can talk about those things and begin to work against them without actually giving credence to a lot of the more prejudiced, ugly, awful things. So I think that the framing has switched, and that has largely happened because, quite frankly, Anthony, a lot of moderates are not actually moderate. They're actually Republican and right-wing curious. They're very open to these ideas, and they want to have the legitimacy to start portraying them and start communicating them and supporting them. So instead of doing that, we should be looking at the material conditions that led us to this point.
I think a really good example of this is how, remember the price of eggs was like a whole thing during this campaign. And there were some famous, interesting moments when J.D. Vance was complaining about it whilst the price behind him was as low as it's ever been. But in covering this, the cost of groceries, especially eggs as a barometer, the media failed to talk about the fact that the reason the cost of eggs had gone up was that 50 million chickens had been slaughtered because of a bird flu outbreak, and that because of supply chain issues, as with the pandemic, the cost was temporarily inflated. I didn't hear that from anybody.
Well, and Anthony, you and I, just to pull back the curtain, we were talking about this before we started recording, how good it is to have a conversation that's going to go on at some length and detail, right? Yeah. Which is one of the reasons why people are turning to alternative media, why people are turning to podcasts. They want substantive conversation. Our news media has failed us because they actually cover the spectacle of the thing. And what they're missing is a lot of the nuance in this, which is why are egg prices the way they are? Why did inflation happen, which was a combination of corporate greed and also the consequences of the war in Ukraine and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Those things combined for that. Unfortunately, the Democratic Party didn't do a good job of explaining those things either for a variety of reasons. We were told constantly, well, the economy's good. Well, the economy, in terms of like the measures that we have of it, it actually measures how well corporations are exploiting people.
Right.
It doesn't measure what it actually feels like to live in the United States of America. I come from a very poor family, and I have to tell you that the past few decades have felt increasingly precarious. People have had to go without medicine. They've had to, take on massive amounts of debt. The way that the economy feels in the lives of the average American, a lot of which have been forgotten about and haven't been talked about, it's been awful. And unless you give them an explanation for why that occurred and also give them a way out, then you're not going to get very far. The problem here is that the 2024 election came down to this. We had one side which has remained increasingly conservative in protecting the institutions, which is saying, hey, they're not actually as bad as you think they are. Look at these charts. Here's what this economist has to say about it. We need to protect these things. You have another side which says, this stuff is awful. Here are the people who caused it. And unfortunately, most voters are not well informed. I mean, I'm sure you've read the same focus groups that I have. People who make these decisions often make them irrationally. They make them based on emotions and how they feel, and they're not really following the issues the way a lot of people are. Our media has failed us, our political parties have failed us, and we have to change if we're actually going to go anywhere different.
The polls you talk about, let's just look at a couple of things. Americans hold divided views on Trump's second term. 2 separate polls by YouGov in the week after the election. Many of Trump's voters are eager for action on immigration and economic reforms. Kamala Harris's voters, on the other hand, express deep concerns about Trump taking office. Many express fears that democracy will erode and fundamental rights will be lost. What's so interesting to me is one set of views is holistic, and the other set of views is very specific. And in my view, that's kind of why Trump won, because he was able to go immigration in the same way that he branded build the wall. It's kind of irrelevant that he didn't build it, but it sounded good. And it's the same with the economy. He was never probed. He never put himself in front of journalists who were able to ask him questions as to how he might reduce the cost of groceries. We both know that he doesn't have the ability to do that. So does this mean that this election, and the reason that there are some people who are thinking, it was a fraudulent election, is because it was the lies that were fraudulent? It wasn't the voting machines, it was the lies, it was the disinformation that made it feel like a completely fraudulent election, because Trump made a whole bunch of promises he simply can't keep.
I would invite people to compare Donald Trump to Ronald Reagan. And in a way, you can look back at the 1980 election and look at how Ronald Reagan won. He didn't have actual solutions. He told people what the problem supposedly was, which was the government, right? And stagflation was a larger problem than that. And Jimmy Carter attempted to explain to people what the problem was, logically, and say, hey, you're going to have to really do without a few things and do this. Guess what? People vote oftentimes, particularly when things get very precarious, based on vibes and how things feel. One of the reasons that MAGA has become the massive political force and the cult that it is because in a time of great precarity and pain and, quite frankly, terror, it's telling people, feel good in your anger and give less. Become more selfish. And that feeds into this giant loop that, unfortunately, neoliberalism and technocratic ideas don't work within. And we don't have to just look in the United States of America. If you look around the world, you will notice that neoliberals, who particularly rely on technocratic facts, they don't get very far in these elections. And if you look at history, this authoritarian cycle that we're currently in, it's about harvesting anger and dissatisfaction and terror and then using it for the purposes, and I can't believe we've gotten this far without saying it. MAGA is not a populist movement. It's a faux populist movement that works on behalf of the people who got us in this situation in the first place. The problem is that we didn't hear anything on the other side. The Democratic Party couldn't talk about Elon Musk being part of the issue because the Democratic Party and the institutions rely on Elon Musk for our space agencies, for our defense programs. He's basically become an essential part of the government at this point. So as a result, they get a shortcut. They get every way possible, whether it's lying, using misinformation, using racism and inherent prejudices. And meanwhile, neoliberals are continuing to fight the same losing battle over and over and refusing to learn their mistakes.
So what you're describing, and if I can quote from your Substack, is a pseudo-environment. You say that Trump is an avatar, a useful idiot, and we spend most of our lives only learning about the pseudo-environment versus the actual material conditions. And then you write about Elon Musk, saying he's the most high profile of this. He can't help but make himself the center of attention, but Musk is representative of an oligarchical class that is dead set on overtaking the government and refashioning it as described. It's nice when someone reads back your own writing, isn't it? It's probably the greatest thing you can ever experience. I was quite taken with this, the idea that we are fighting on ground zero over immigration, economy, these kind of blanket topics. But actually, This broligarchy is this kind of new word to describe what's really going on. This kind of hyper-masculine, super wealthy, this Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk movement that is actually pulling many of the strings because they hold all the power.
Yeah, and I want to invite people very, very quickly, because part of the issue, Anthony, is that Americans are so self-involved that we have a hard time thinking about our politics being the same as countries around the world, right? I want you to imagine that you pick up a newspaper and you read about some supposed second or third world country, which is how these things are always referred to. They've been taken over by an absolutely clownish, buffoonish tin pot dictator. You know, the kind that wear military uniforms and cover themselves in badges that they haven't earned, right? From America, we look at those countries, we understand that those tin pot dictators are not only ridiculous and unserious, but that they're being controlled by larger corporations and by wealthy people who want to use those people for labor and want to take their resources. We understand that. That's what's happened in the United States of America. We get so caught up, and the news media, by the way, has absolutely played into this, right? Yeah. It's all soap opera. It's professional wrestling.
Right.
We're talking about Trump. We're talking about Biden, Democrats, and Republicans. Meanwhile, what are we not talking about here, Anthony? We're not talking about the actual material conditions that feed into all these personality politics. And these issues, these divisive issues, whether it's immigration, trans bathroom rights, any of these things, groomers in public education, right? What they actually are, they're meticulously crafted divisive strategies that have been cooked up by billionaires and their think tanks and institutes. They keep us from talking about actual things, right? So for instance, immigration. What's immigration actually about? It's about how much labor should cost. It's about whether or not some people get paid cents on the dollar and whether other people will take less money to do the jobs because they're afraid that immigrants will go ahead and take those jobs, right? If we're talking about groomers in public education, what are we actually talking about? We're talking about people's fear of the unknown and things that they're prejudiced against. We're not talking about investing in public schools, right? We're talking about taking money out of public schools, which nobody actually wants to do on its face. So this pseudo environment is an environment that is completely conducive to the whims of the oligarchical wealth class. So as a result, we keep churning and tearing ourselves apart, and we keep moving further and further away from the actual issues and from a direction that would actually serve everybody except for the oligarchical class. And we continue to hand them victory after victory.
And invariably, the people that are pulling the strings, they don't have name recognition. We don't talk about Leonard Leo, for example, at the Federalist Society, somebody who was interviewed by NPR a few days ago, and he said that he wanted to crush liberal dominance, and he's created this new network to recruit, connect, and deploy talented conservatives who lead opinion and shape the industries that shape society. That's taken directly from their website. He used the word shape twice in a sentence, which I would have a very big problem with. But this is the issue, isn't it? They often fail in the detail, but they are good at the big picture stuff. And he is somebody who has helped install these extremist high court judges, Supreme Court judges, and, effectively taken away all the guardrails of protection. And what was interesting about Leonard Leo in that very rare interview that he did with Steve Inskeep was that he said, well, we have guardrails to protect us. We have these separation of powers. We have these institutions. And yet these institutions have been infiltrated by Leonard Leo and his people at every level. This blanket immunity for the president, the Supreme Court now filled, packed with these evangelical MAGA Christians. It's complete, and also obviously the House and the Senate being won by the Republican Party. There is no guardrail now at any level in the American political institutions. And if we look to these appointments that Trump is making, it's clear that they are designed to deconstruct the very pillars that we have gotten used to over the years.
Yes, and to understand this, I need people to have a little bit of historical context. And Anthony, this is not stuff that we should have to talk about.
I know.
This is stuff that should be taught in schools.
Yeah.
And the fact that people haven't learned the actual history of the country should tell you everything you need to know about why we've arrived at this point. This assault on liberal democracy started in 1971 with something called the Powell Memo that anybody who hasn't read it should go read it. This was after the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s movements, including civil rights, the feminist movement, the anti-war movement, the gay rights movement. Basically, a lot of the millionaires in this country got together and said, hey, things are moving in a direction that we do not like. We feel small d democratic power is starting to gain power and purchase over culture and politics. We need to spend our money creating an infrastructure that pulls that back. We don't believe in small d democracy. We don't believe the government should be helping people. We don't believe the government should be regulating things. We need to assert our power. Guess what they did? That. And they were incredibly successful with it. And they were successful in a way that people not only weren't aware of, but there's been no parallel structure to it. There's nothing happening within liberal circles that even closely resembles what the wealth class did starting in the early 1970s, taking over government, leading to Ronald Reagan becoming the president, and also ushering in an era of increasing neoliberalism and authoritarianism. They have absolutely demolished liberal democracy since then, rolling back every piece of progress, going back to the progressive movement of the early 20th century. That's been their plan all along. And guess what? They're on the precipice of absolutely achieving their goal whole cloth.
And convincing people that that's what the people want as well. That's been the greatest confidence trick, is making people think that deregulation is healthy.
They're incredibly good at it.
Yeah.
And the problem is that the neoliberal consensus that emerged, it's basically led to the Democratic Party fighting with not just one arm, but both arms tied behind their backs. They can't talk about this stuff because they rely on the same people for money. They can't talk about this stuff because they have helped create it along the way, because they believe that free markets, which were never free, that were absolutely captured by these people, were going to help them. The last time there was an active measure, what did it do? It changed the economy to give people like Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, and this entire new tech oligarch class all of the money with no regulation whatsoever. There has to be a moment of self-reflection. There has to be a moment where we realize that the direction that things have gone in has been destructive. And if we're going to save any of the progress of the 20th century and add to it, which we have to, it's going to take a completely different course. But we also can't just wait around on them to wake up and decide to do that. We have to create pressure on the populist, actual grassroots level to pressure them into doing that. We need to learn from the progressive movement, the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, the anti-war movement, and the gay rights movement, and realize that those pieces of progress did not happen naturally. They were forced to happen. And hopefully this is a moment of clarity where we can start to actually engage in that and actually start the work that needs to be done.
And for people who might not understand the truth of this, we saw it in this election campaign. It started with Elon Musk buying Twitter and overpaying to the tune of $44 billion for something that a few months later wasn't worth even a quarter of that, so that he could rewrite the narrative in the town square. And now we're seeing this mass exodus because people finally, after the election, are like, oh, maybe it's time to leave and go elsewhere. We also saw Elon Musk in interviews, I think with Joe Rogan and others, basically say that, if Trump loses, I'm finished. And you had to kind of read into that and be like, wow, this is the richest, arguably most powerful man in the world, with all these government contracts and all these Starlink satellites enabling the world and war zones to be able to communicate, who has control of the switch, laying all his cards on the table, because his politics was ambiguous before this campaign, wasn't it? People weren't quite sure where he stood. The same with Bezos, who eventually then came out and said that the Washington Post couldn't support a candidate. Their cards were basically laid on the table in those last few weeks of the campaign, weren't they?
Yes, and what are they doing now? These tech oligarchs were completely at each other's throat, but Anthony, they're all bringing parallel lawsuits against the National Labor Relations Board right now to basically undermine any sort of organizing in the United States of America. Also, an added component of that, you'll notice that all of the people that we're talking about, man, they've been really cozy with dictators and authoritarian regimes around the world for the last few years. Isn't it weird that there's now an anti-U.S. axis that has been created with China, Russia, and a bunch of countries that these same oligarchs have been working with? It is a tipping point. It's very much like what we saw in the 1930s going into the 1940s, in which Great Britain's control over capitalism was then being confronted by, Germany and Italy and Japan, and then a whole bunch of other countries that wanted to take it for themselves. What we're talking about here is a final mad dash. And part of it is the fact that Donald Trump is old and decrepit and decaying. They understand that MAGA was maybe their last best chance to use this cult of faux populism to go ahead and use him as a weapon and as a battering ram. I invite you once again to think about him as a tin-pot dictator in a quote-unquote second or third world country that is under the control of oligarchs and corporations. So what did they do? They pushed all of their chips in the middle. And quite frankly, am I mad about it? Absolutely I am. Does it make me mad that it's putting people in danger? Absolutely. But logically, when you get to this point of wealth and power and influence, it's only logical that you would do this, right? That you would start gobbling up all these communication organs, all of these propaganda organs, that you would start buying off politicians, that you would start buying off governments. That has been the case since the beginning of capitalism and the emergence of the first corporation. Great Britain, if you don't understand it, go back and look at the empirical corporations that helped carry out colonization. They took over the government, and they had to be wrested away the same way this continually happens. But this is a mad dash to finish the job that we've been talking about. And I have to tell you, they're not going to simply give up. They're going to see this job through unless they are stopped.
And that really, in this short term, is what a lot of people feel Joe Biden should be doing. Because there's a lot of talk of people saying, what is Biden doing? What is Harris doing? Why are they not protecting us from this takeover in these last few days before the inauguration, especially considering that Biden has immunity to all intents and purposes? Do you think that there's anything happening behind the scenes? Because we know that he's appointing judges at quite a rate, which can only be a good thing. But at the same time, pardon power, executive privilege, I mean, there are ways to kind of go forward in this moment, in these short kind of last few weeks. Have you thought about that?
Yeah, I think in order to understand it, we both have to focus and unfocus when we're talking about Biden and the legacy in this particular moment. So on one hand, beyond Biden, let's talk about material conditions, the way that things occur, right? This idea that there's a quote unquote deep state, while it is a complete conspiracy theory and it's based on the protocols of the elders of Zion, let's also not pretend that there isn't an administrative state that takes place in bureaucracies, plus also the military industrial complex. What are they doing right now? We're watching a lot of movement in Ukraine, because a lot of people expect Donald Trump to betray not just NATO, but the United States of America and Ukraine. So we're starting to see, including allowing Ukraine to use long-range missiles. We're already hearing talks that France and the UK are thinking about putting troops in Ukraine and preparing for a possible World War III scenario. Those things have been happening. When it comes to Joe Biden, and I think this is something historically people need to understand, there are a lot of situations where a president doesn't have power. Right? Like they're a figurehead and they can like use the bully pulpit to try and move politics. There are times where they have power, times where they don't have power. Joe Biden came in 2021 with a lot of power and actually wanted to have a transformative presidency. He was scuttled by Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, who were bought and sold by the same oligarchical interests that you and I have been talking about, right? Joe Biden is an institutionalist. He's been in government for half a century, and his position within the Democratic Party wasn't necessarily to make waves, it was to go with the waves where they were going. To expect him to use his power at this point, I think we have enough evidence to understand that there aren't going to be a lot of guardrails that are going to be erected. but we also need to understand that the possibility was there, right? We can't become nihilistic and think that things can't change because Joe Biden's Joe Biden. We have to understand that there are moments in which they serve as crossroads. And if you have somebody who will use those moments and move the leverage and power that they have, things can change. But we reached this point in which things were scuttled in the same way we've been talking about. And I think anything that we're watching, it includes federal judges. I think you're correct in that. And also what the NATO alliance is starting to do in preparation for a Trump presidency and a possible World War III scenario.
It's frightening to hear those words, isn't it? But Donald Trump warned us. He kept saying, there will be World War III if you don't vote for me. But actually that was a scam, effectively. And that World War III, or whatever you choose to call it, because of course we've got Israel bombing the Lebanon, as we speak, in such a way and trying to leverage ceasefires. We are starting to see warfare in places we really don't want to see it. And Iran is just around the corner, and I'm sure that Donald Trump has plans for Iran, as he had last time and was potentially stopped by his generals. We have to take a quick break, but I want to come back and continue talking on that topic and a whole lot more. We'll do that next here on The Weekend Show. Did you know that 4 companies control over 80% of the US meat industry, and China now controls the largest portion of US pork? These companies are using mobster-like tactics to crush American family farms, and with the additives they're putting into our food, Americans are stuck with sketchy meat. So what can we do about this? Let me tell you about a company that's coming up swinging on behalf of American family farms and your family's food security. Moink. Their business is simple. Moink's meat comes from animals raised outdoors where a pig is free to be a pig. Their farmers are given an honest day's pay for an honest day's work, and they deliver meat straight to your doorstep at prices you can actually afford. Born, raised, and harvested right here in the United States. Support American family farms and join the Moink movement today at moinkbox.com/weekend right now and get free wings for life. The best wings you'll ever taste for free, but for a limited time. Spelt MOINK box.com/weekend. That's moinkbox.com/weekend. We're back on The Weekend Show with Jared Yates Sexton. I'm Anthony Davis. So the world has never felt so unsafe as it does this week, with the potential of Donald Trump to come in January and like a bulldog in a china shop. And he's already lining up a whole bunch of changes on day one. And day one, it seems, has been a kind of a rally cry for this movement. But also we're seeing destabilization around the world. Certainly in Ukraine, of course, with Russia, but the Middle East too. Just talk to me about the bigger picture for a second, because Donald Trump claimed that during his presidency there was no war, no new war. That wasn't quite accurate, but he carefully, as a great propagandist, he made people believe that was the case. But what he's coming into now is a very unstable world. He claimed he'd be able to end the Ukraine war before he even got into office with a phone call. That's not going to happen, is it?
No, it's not. And I would ask your listeners and viewers to just give me a second. I don't want to get too far in the weeds, but this is a complicated situation. I believe it's my moral and ethical imperative to explain to people what is happening in order to prepare themselves and understand it. So the American empire is in decline. I don't think that's going to come as a shock to you or anybody else. We know this, we understand it, we feel it in our bones. It's one of the reasons why an authoritarian movement can gain power, right? As a country starts to decline, they start looking into what you would almost refer to as suicidal movements and cycles, right? So what happened was the development of the American empire, not just post-World War II, but post-Cold War. Empires don't just expand on their own. It's, we're made to think a country goes and conquers places and that's what happens. No, it also includes economic movements, right? So as America expanded its control over the world, capitalism, or neoliberal capitalism, to be more concrete about it, used America to open up markets, to create trade routes, to create relationships between, again, so-called first world, second world, and third world countries. Second and third world countries would be used for their labor and their resources, and the first world countries, including America and its allies, would have the benefits of cheap goods and all of the profits. Well, guess what? At some point or another, capitalism does not like order. It hates order. There's a reason why World War I and World War II happened. It's because we had these upstart countries, namely Germany, that wanted to upset the British Empire's control over capitalism. They wanted the colonies for themselves. They wanted the resources for themselves, right? Monopolies always end up leading into very bitter rivalries over power. So we've arrived at the point where the American empire has pretty much reached its zenith. It created all these trade routes. It created all these markets and extraction of resources. It was only a matter of time that we were going to have a rival or an axis of rivals, including China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, India at this point, that came together and started to use that as a means of trying to take over the system. For people who don't understand this yet, I would invite people to think about Gaza and Lebanon and what Israel is doing as an example of our waning influence, right? It's one of those countries. Israel has its relationship with America. It's a client state of the United States. It also has a close relationship with Russia. And what happens if the United States abandons Israel? They'll go to Russia or they'll go to China, right? Saudi Arabia does this all the time. They play both sides against each other because they're trying to get favorable outcomes. So what has happened? The destabilization has occurred. Putin called our bluff. He went ahead and invaded Ukraine and showed that he could bypass American support and British support, and he could use Russia for whatever he lost in those other places. Almost like a bypass, a heart bypass, right? So we've now reached this point in which we are heading towards a major world conflict. And I invite people to think back again to the 1920s and 1930s as Hitler and Germany was preparing World War II. The United States was not always going to be on the side of the Allies. There was a moment in time in which we had a burgeoning fascist and Nazi movement within the United States of America. And Anthony, you know as well as I do that was avoided because of the New Deal, because we created a big, giant, aggressive economic plan that went ahead and bought off fascists and got them in jobs, right? Well, we also had a bunch of Nazis and fascists who wanted us to stay out of the war, to become isolationist. It would probably help while the authoritarian axis was gobbling up countries if the United States of America was, I don't know, under the control of a person who didn't actually care about the United States and also was an isolationist. So we're in another moment of choosing sides. And the United States of America is currently on a trajectory to stay out of this larger conflict, to let China take Taiwan, to let Russia take Ukraine, to let all these regimes start to gobble up as much land and as many resources as they possibly can.
And the thinking, if I just put my European glasses on for a moment, the thinking in Europe is very different. Now, NATO is scrambling right now, because they recognize that Trump, with his renewed vigor and the support of Russia, or certainly the control by Russia, will probably want to pull the US out of the NATO alliance at some point, or at least threaten it in the short term. And not just over countries not paying their fair share. They already played that card. There'll be more to come. And so Europe is having to position itself to take on Russia and support Ukraine in a way that European nations do because they have history and because the Second World War is still so present in their minds. America and Americans don't really see the war in the same way that Europeans do, not just because they were late to the war, but also because in public schools they rewrote the story, certainly the story we teach in Europe, that America won the war for the Europeans. And I've heard that said a few times, and I'm like, whoa, hang on, that's not how we knew of it, as grateful as we were for the help. And of course, the fact that America didn't see mainland conflict apart from in Hawaii. So, there's history plays a huge part in how this is going to play out. The isolationist thinking is so baked into this Republican Donald Trump movement, isn't it? I mean, they really, It's all hands off, withdraw all troops, we don't want anything to do with it, and yet at the same time, boasting that we have the most powerful military in the world.
Yeah, and on that note, I would caution people to keep a lookout, which is the missing component of MAGA as a full fascist energy is militarism. It's starting to use the military for the purposes of empire. And we've already heard what they've thought about, which is a literal war with Mexico or obliterating Iran, right? Like a real a starting up of that engine. And we would not necessarily just be on the sidelines if this new war started up. I think a really good example of this, and Americans are pretty ignorant of it, would be the conflict in Syria, which is a constantly bewildering, confusing, all over the place mess in which some days you're working with some countries, other days you're accidentally bombing one another. Over here you're together, over here you're not together. I think what we need to understand here, first of all, is what you just said is exactly right. Americans do not have an actual working understanding of World War II or World War I for that matter. Europeans have it within their cultural DNA. They were destroyed. There's a reason why the United States became the main power of the world. It's because Europe was on life support following World War II. I would be remiss if I didn't point out that one of the major problems is that immediately once Germany surrendered, the United States and Great Britain started working with former Nazis and fascists in order to go after their own allies, the Soviet Union. It's kind of the reason we arrived at this point in the first place. But I do think that the isolationist trend here, it's not an accident. The oligarchs who have made this country really, really precarious are relying on people to not want to help other people. And you brought up Great Britain, and I've brought it up a couple of times in the history. I want to remind people of something, which is when the Roman Empire started to decline, when it actually started to decline, it wasn't just Rome being sacked. It was when Britannia was facing a threat, and the Roman Empire sent a courier that said, hey, you're on your own, sorry. And that is what we're looking at this point. The United States is in decline, and a lot of these security engagements and promises that we've made are going to fall by the wayside. And it's going to fall on Europe to start dealing with this. And again, Great Britain, France, and Germany are all beset by right-wing parties that are gaining power and purchase. So maybe we're going to have another world war, or maybe we're just going to have a capitulation in which everybody gets on the same page. Or we might choose a different path and actually avoid the war and actually have a better future that includes small d democracy. It's kind of up to us, but we have to understand the choice we're making.
Warfare looks different these days as well, doesn't it? Because it's not so much about boots on the ground as it's more of a Cold War in a way, isn't it? It's an electronic warfare. Look at during this last election where we saw these bomb threats at these swing state polling places that emanated from Russia. Look at the way that these pages were exploited by Israel, that belonged to Hamas, that exploded. This was a long game. This kind of warfare is completely new. Aside from the disinformation warfare that we see go on social media and the algorithm that has completely changed people's view of the world so that their reality is completely distorted. Yours and my reality can be completely different just based on the social media that we consume. That is brilliant, but it's also terrifying and devastating, and clearly played into the result in this recent election here. So how do you think warfare will look when we talk about World War III and we say it, we do not say it with any thrill whatsoever. It is completely terrifying that we are at a place now in the world that is so discombobulated that miscommunication, or lack of communication even, can bring us to this point. What do you think that would look like, considering these new skills that countries like Russia have, where they're basically able to use their computers as weapons?
If I had to go ahead and guess, I would say it would look a lot like a combination of what's happened in Ukraine, which is sort of the connective nations, to go ahead and use a hierarchical system. A lot of these countries that lie between the great powers sort of skirmishes, basically using proxies at that point, much like we've done with, Afghanistan multiple times towards multiple state powers at this point. But I think the larger aspect of this, and I'm glad you brought it up this way, I think we need to understand how corporations in this oligarchical class are not contained within countries anymore, right? They're transnational bodies. They're actually larger than the nation states, and then they sort of latch onto the nation states and use them. So what we're looking at right now, and this is something, and again, we've talked about how our media has failed this. This has not been discussed. We're currently at the beginning of a reindustrialization of the United States of America. We're driving down wages at this point so we can pay people, cheap and exploit their labor. Also, we're in this new Cold War with China, which means that we can't rely on them for a lot of the products we need. The CHIPS Act that Biden passed was part of this, but you better believe that they are going to open a lot of factories and a lot of manufacturing centers, and people are not going to get paid well, and it's going to be brutal. The chances are that a lot of World War III is going to be corporate espionage. It's going to be hacking. It's going to be shutting off of power. It's going to be stealing state secrets. And more or less, if you really want to get into the weeds of this, the dropping of bombs and shooting of bullets in wars has an economic factor to it. What do you bomb? Yes, you bomb factories that create weaponry, but you're actually trying to hurt the economy of the other country. So the chances are, like with the presence of the nuclear bomb and nuclear weapons, you're probably not going to get into as many firefights as you necessarily were in the past, though those will certainly exist. But sort of the veins of the global system are going to allow people to come in. I mean, that's what we've seen with the internet and social media. So it will probably be a hybrid type of warfare that, unfortunately, I don't think a lot of people are going to be aware of, but will be exploited by people like Trump. Like, I'll go ahead and say it now, and you can put it on the record. Over the 4 years of Trump being president, hopefully, knock on wood, that's all it is, you are going to see things happen, including blackouts, including massive hacking attacks that take away telecommunications. And who knows where they're going to come from. We're going to be told it's enemies of the state. We're going to be told, that it was like bad people in the deep state or whatever. And we're never going to know the truth of it. It's going to be such an asymmetrical type situation. It's going to be hard to keep track of.
He is very clever about that. And let me use his assassination attempt as an example, where he basically referred to the shooter as they. Yep. Look what they tried to do to me. Now, when investigated, the shooter was clearly a Trump supporter from a family of Trump supporters, and yet things got so bad on that side of the aisle that their own people were starting to shoot at their leader. That's how I see it. And yet there was again a media blackout on who this kid was. There was very little discussed because Trump rewrote the narrative, and as did his surrogates. Look what they tried to do to me. They tried to take me out on multiple occasions. This, to me, was a barefaced example of how you can rewrite the story. And I do think it probably helped his election chances, the fact that someone tried to shoot at him. I mean, this is just so powerful for his propaganda movement. Elon Musk famously said, look, they didn't even try and kill Kamala Harris because there's no point. I mean, that was a pretty low blow.
Oh, it absolutely is. And our media failed in that. Actually, there were three quote unquote assassination attempts of Donald Trump, right? One wasn't even an assassination attempt. It was a supporter who tried to bring a gun into a rally, right? With fake credentials. Then we have this other situation where someone was maybe going to take a pot shot at him at a golf course. That person's politics are completely inscrutable. Yeah. Like trying to take a look at them, you have no idea.
Yeah.
The one who shot him or supposedly shot him in Pennsylvania, you take a look at him, he is a right-winger who has all of these like ideological perspectives that the media never even touched.
Right. What
was the story? Donald Trump is so dangerous that people will try and kill him. And I don't think it's a coincidence that parallels stories about Jeffrey Epstein. Jeffrey Epstein was, people believe murdered in captivity because he knew too much and he was dangerous to the establishment. The fact that our media aired around the clock pictures of Donald Trump raising his fist while he was bleeding, it did the work for him. And quite frankly, it was what our media wanted. They wanted a story like this. It drove people to their networks. It made people feel like they had someone who was going to be strong for them on their behalf. And a lot of people, unfortunately, when they get frightened, when they face terrifying situations and precarity, they want someone strong. They want somebody who's going to fight for them. And that doesn't make it right to vote for him, but on an instinctual psychological level, you start to understand why people who don't like the way the country works are going to go in that direction. It helps even more when they're racist and sexist and xenophobic and transphobic and nativist ideas are being activated at the same time. It's a really poisonous cocktail.
And also when their opponent is female and an incumbent, these things were all stacked against the Democrats. And the timing of that, the timing of Joe Biden only giving Kamala Harris 100 days to pull a campaign together, the trajectory was very positive, but nobody, no matter how many billions were raised, would be able to win against Donald Trump. I'm saying this with hindsight, of course. Trump has been campaigning for a decade. He never stopped doing rallies, even when he was president. And this is who he is. This is how much importance there was on his win, not just from him because he wanted to stay out of prison, but from the puppeteers who were controlling him.
Yeah, I think when talking about this, I think it's important to remember Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico, who was given a massive mandate to become president of Mexico in a country that many people are very happy to label as misogynistic, right? And why was she able to win? It was because she created a populist message that said, these people are responsible, we're going to take care of them. Which, just a reminder, that was also the basis of a black man who won the presidency of the United States of America in 2008. These are the people who have done this. I'm going to put it right. A reminder, Barack Obama won my home state of Indiana, which was under the control of the Ku Klux Klan in the 20th century, right? If I had to break down where the Democrats went wrong, I would have to go through a whole list of things, including the fact, and this is going to be some tough love, and I have to assume the comments section will take me to task, and I'm fine with that. The Democratic Party did not admit that Joe Biden was in decline. They hid it. They didn't talk about it until it had to be seen. And as a result, they were not able to hold together a primary. I do think that hurt Kamala Harris. I think it would have made her a sharper candidate. It also would have changed her agenda. That's what primaries are actually for, not just...
And the Republicans seized on that, though, didn't they? Because the Democrats didn't mention it, but the Republicans were the ones saying she didn't have a mandate to lead. And so that became a talking point.
It absolutely did. And quite frankly, again, I think it weakened her as a candidate. And what happened? Instead of being able to go through a primary and create her own campaign staff, Anthony, she relied on Joe Biden's campaign staff, which ensured that she was never going to differentiate herself from Joe Biden, except for to say the one thing that she would change is she would have more Republicans in her cabinet. And if you actually take a look at what happened over the course of the campaign, like her own brother-in-law, who is a CEO or executive within Uber, told her to stop with the populist messaging. We started hearing about how she had the support of Goldman Sachs and economists and billionaires, and Liz Cheney started showing up. And all of a sudden we're thanking Dick Cheney for all of his contributions to American politics. So what ends up happening is those mistakes on their own would have been bad. When you add that to the fact that the Democratic Party didn't explain that corporate Democrats like Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema scuttled the agenda, when you go ahead and say, hey, look at the numbers, the economy is fine, and tell people not to believe their experiences, and on top of that, you don't have an answer on things like Gaza, which drove away a large part of the youth vote. When you bring all those things together, and your main issue in the lead up to the election is illegal immigration, which is Donald Trump's pet project that he's been carrying out for 10 years, that's not a recipe for success. It really doesn't matter how much money you put behind that. It's eventually going to hit a brick wall, which unfortunately we saw happen.
Kamala Harris has said in the last few days that, she's considering all her options, but she would think about running again. I don't think that necessarily is a bad idea, because I do think that she would make a great president. But I have said in previous conversations that I don't think she's a great candidate. And there is a difference between being a good candidate and a good president. But that aside for a moment, the Democrats clearly need a clean sheet of paper right now, don't they? Yes. And running Kamala Harris again really doesn't do that. It's the same playbook with tweaks. And this, as I'm learning from having lived here a while now, that this really is a theme with the Democratic Party, is this failure to reform.
Yes.
And that, they're slowly versus these, broad changes that Donald Trump kind of talks in. Yes. So what should the Democratic Party be doing if not running Kamala Harris again? How could they go forward, considering that there is this monolithic opposition now?
So I think what we have seen in the post-election environment is something I expected to happen, but I was really shocked by how quickly it occurred. There's a rank and file of the Democratic apparatchik that have just had the same jobs for, going back to the Clinton administration. I saw an interview with James Carville this morning. I was like, man, he's still making dates, and it doesn't matter if they're successful or not. I do have to say that blaming the voters is not like how you actually push a party forward. You have to take a look at the tactics that you've had. The Democratic Party, starting in the 1990s, embraced Reaganism with a quote-unquote human face. That has to change. You can't blame gay and trans people. You can't blame black people. You can't blame Hispanic people. You can't blame women. You can't blame young people. You have to take a look at what didn't land here. And people keep saying, well, look at all the incumbents around the world. They failed. Yes, they were all neoliberals. And they all failed because people are rejecting neoliberalism because they don't trust it, because they recognize that things have been going in the wrong direction for a very long time. They will go ahead, and particularly if they have racism and sexism, xenophobia, transphobia, homophobia, you name it, they'll go ahead and go with a person who's a demagogue. But many of them, again, went out to vote for Barack Obama, right? They wanted to change. They voted for Joe Biden in 2020 in the face of a disastrous Trump presidency. It's obvious that people are desperate for change. And on top of that, if you look at the numbers, we're losing a lot of people who are dropping out of the political process. It's not enough to say this is where the pie is. We have to meet people here. That is a sure route to disaster. You have to grow the pie. You have to create something that people can believe in. People do not believe the Democratic Party will fight for them. They think the Democratic Party will say they will fight for them, or they'll do gestures. They'll kneel during the BLM protest. But they're like, oh, we don't need to talk about divestment and investment in communities, right? Like, we don't want to do that. The problem is that the party needs to coalesce around the idea of interdependence, which is the same thing that's happening to me, is happening to you, is happening to a worker in a red state that you might think isn't worth your support. It's trans people. It's people around the world. It's Palestinians. It's people who are unhoused. You have to create something of meaning, which is what MAGA did. The meaning is false, but the idea of meaning is what pushes fascism and authoritarian movements. It's belonging and a purpose, and a lot of Americans are desperate for belonging and purpose, and the Democratic Party needs to create its own structure that actually moves towards change.
And that's the irony of Trump's offering, is that it is entirely a confidence trick.
Yes.
So he says, I'm here for you. They're not coming after me, they're coming after you, reframing everything so that he is a representative of the people, and yet the people disgust him. And he has no apparatus for doing anything for the people. There might be a tax cut or a rebate check, as he used in his last presidency, that made people falsely and temporarily feel like they were winning. Was a rebate, was a refund on their own tax payments. But what I want to ask you is, there's talk now that maybe we misread what America was, and that actually America always was the Donald Trump MAGA movement, and that the Joe Biden win in 2020 was a blip. It wasn't, and maybe COVID obviously contributed to that because Trump was screwing it up so badly. But actually America is, and always has been, but never really had a voice, this kind of far-right, isolationist country, and that Joe Biden's presidency was a kind of temporary reprieve, but now we're back into that kind of GOP movement, or whatever it is going to look like next.
I think that's accurate. And I think 2020 is now obviously a blip. I don't think if COVID would have happened that anybody would have beat Donald Trump. I think he would have went ahead and got a consecutive second term. And I think the data is showing us that is the case. And people literally wanted to believe that Joe Biden would fix it and move us beyond Donald Trump. That didn't happen, right? Like, God knows how many people at this point have died from COVID. It's still circulating. We've just become sort of, numb to it and in denial of it. And on top of that, like, things were not put to right. The Republican Party did not wake up from their fever, right? if you actually look at the history of America, unfortunately, this is a racist, sexist, xenophobic country that has been run by a power-hungry oligarchy since the very beginning. That was the nature of the founding of the United States of America. People say to me all the time, can you believe that the institutions are working like this? Yes, they were designed to. They were created by wealthy, white, slave-owning men who wanted to create structures that took care of white, slave-owning, wealthy, white men, right? So, yes, but I don't think that's nihilistic. I think understanding the way it's actually worked and then looking at the pockets of change. I brought up the civil rights movement a while ago. Liberals were largely opposed to the civil rights movement. Democrats were not interested in necessarily signing civil rights legislation. You know what happened? They were forced to do it by a group of conscientious activists who got together and showed people what was happening and told them, hey, this is where your privilege comes from. We need to change things. And the Democratic Party eventually said, you know what? You're right. Let's do it. I don't think this is a dead end. And a lot of people now are saying, what are you going to do? America is racist and sexist. Well, no kidding. America has always been racist and sexist. There are moments of progress that have been squandered and have been capitalized on. We need to create another moment of progress that will not be squandered. And I still believe, based on looking throughout history, even the history of the United States of America, I still think that is possible. But I don't think simply saying it's racist and sexist, that's it. I don't think that bears out. I don't think it's accurate, and I don't think it gets us anywhere.
I'm an optimist, so I do believe that, when you go so low, there's only really one way you can return. And I'm holding on to that, Jared. I'll be honest with you. We have to take another break. We'll come back and continue in just a moment here on The Weekend Show. When you think about businesses that are selling through the roof, like Alo or Allbirds or Skims, sure, you think about a great product, a cool brand, and brilliant marketing, but an often overlooked secret is actually the businesses behind the business, making selling and for shoppers buying simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. Nobody does selling better than Shopify. And the not-so-secret secret with Shop Pay that boosts conversions by up to 50%, meaning way less carts going abandoned and way more sales going... So, if you're into growing your business, your commerce platform better be ready to sell wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling, on the web, in your store, in their feed, and everywhere in between. Businesses that sell more sell on Shopify. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout that Allbirds uses. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/weekend, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/weekend to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/weekend. Jared Yates Sexton, Donald Trump is talking about throwing things back to the states. This seems to be potentially the kind of secret ingredient to the next presidency. And let's use the Department of Education as an example, following on the heels of abortion rights, of course, throwing it back to the state. So it's a lottery. If you happen to be living in a state that has enshrined abortion protections, then you'll get the health care that you need and you deserve. But if you're not lucky in that way, and if you can't afford to cross state lines, or if there is a police force looking for you if you cross state lines, or if there is a healthcare team who fear being prosecuted if they carry out your healthcare. I mean, there's so many layers to this. But let's just talk about education for a moment, because that seems to be where this is headed. That they want to disband the Department of Education. They've chosen somebody completely inappropriate to head up the department, which you could argue is part of the deconstruction of the administrative state. Put the wrong people in charge and watch the institution crumble. But this does again mean that if you are in the wrong state, you're going to get a kind of Bible education, Bible-based education, a Trump Bible-based education, I should add. And Texas has just approved this, so that Bibles now will be, form part of the curriculum. Talk to me about the states and potentially state warfare, which is where some are predicting this could end up.
Well, first of all, I'm going to have to push back. You don't think a wrestling impresario should be in charge of the Department of Education?
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't see the point. No, I want to get into a couple of things because I think this is essential. I'm so glad that we're talking about it. First things first. The states' rights idea began, of course, with slavery. The idea that states should have the possibility of protecting slavery and having slave economies. Of course, we saw where that got us. The next version of it took place after desegregation was ruled by the Supreme Court, which then pushed for the idea that every state should be able to take care of themselves in order to have segregated apartheid educational systems. You know what's funny about it? You brought up abortion. When did abortion become a thing? When they realized that that was a lot better than talking about openly white supremacist education policies. They figured out that they could go ahead and transfer those things over. Jerry Falwell, for anybody who is interested, was like one of the essential components in making that happen. What we're getting to now is not just diminishing federal power and oversight, which is meant to protect individuals of all races, colors, sexes, genders, sexualities, whatever it is. We're also creating a chopped up United States of America. And I'm going to give people a metaphor that I hope will help to explain this. I want people to think about the last time they got on a plane. And I want you to think about when you were booking your plane ticket and you paid the bottom bargain price, right? Maybe you weren't even assigned a seat. You had to wrestle somebody to get a seat. You didn't know if you were going to have somewhere to put your bag. You weren't guaranteed to get on the plane quickly, get off the plane quickly. If you pay a little bit more, you're able to pick your seat. You're able to have overhead storage. If you pay a lot more, they wait on you hand and foot and deliver you drinks and treat you like you're part of the chosen few, right? That is not just how neoliberalism chops everything up. That is what's happening in the United States of America. We are creating a situation where quote-unquote red states or impoverished states are going to be places where only people who can't afford to live elsewhere are going to have to live. They're going to get lesser educations. They're not going to have as many protections. And on top of that, Anthony, because they're not going to be educated very well, and because they're having their abortion rights taken away, you're going to create a permanent underclass of people who are going to be forced into places like factories and jobs that don't pay them very well or have upward advancement or representation with unions. Meanwhile, if you pay a little bit more, you might be able to move to a purple state, a place where there's a possibility of things getting a little bit better. Maybe you have some of the advantages there. And if you play really, really well and you make enough money, you'll get to move to a blue state. And there you're going to have a government that is going to see after people's welfare, and you probably aren't going to have a lot of your rights taken away. That sort of economy versus premium level United States existence has always existed in this country, particularly with the rise of neoliberalism. Now it's going to become institutionalized. We're going to have a new apartheid state with illegal immigrants, which they have no desire to get rid of all of them because our economy absolutely requires them. The people who fund the Republican Party and Donald Trump rely on immigrants to pay them cents on the dollar, and they want to create a state in which those people are afraid and they won't ask for more. What happens with an apartheid? You have an underclass that's being treated like that, and that keeps the lower class from getting out of line because look what we do to these people, it will happen to you. These capitalist structures have played out time and time again. It just so happens that they're being slotted into place now within the United States, and it's going to be very, very firm, and we're going to see a lot of tensions between the states and regions. That's definitely going to come to happen.
I feel like Walt Disney predicted this in the 1950s. He created a Disneyland for Republicans in Florida and a Disney World for Democrats in California. He knew that there would come a point, maybe, where people wouldn't be wanting to travel and they wanted to stay with their own. Do you think there's some truth to that?
Absolutely, I do. Because one of the most lucrative products that exists within the United States of America is your own reality. It is a boutique reality that works and functions the way that you want it to. If you have enough money, again, you can live in a blue state and not worry about what's happening to people in a red state and whether or not they have access to, reproductive rights or basically a decent job. But you add on top of that media, particularly corporate controlled media, and you look at what's happened over the last few years. Remember, we had this whole scare of cancel culture. People are going to get removed from whatever. What did they do? They created an alternate economy. We now have two economies. We have a quote-unquote woke economy and an anti-woke economy that you can live in either one that you want. Social media has now reflected that. What we're seeing right now is a segmentation. And what happens is you can go ahead and watch the movies and TV shows and live the American experience that keeps you away from what's actually happening and sort of the suffering that's occurring. You can also go ahead and live in the fantasy of this anti-woke world in which all this stuff is conquered. Meanwhile, where we come together, which includes politics, the legal system, other facets of basic shared living, that's where the conflict is going to get worse and the polarization is going to get worse and worse.
Let's talk for a second about these appointments, these Trump cabinet appointments.
If we have to, sure.
Just briefly, because I think it'll lead us on to something else. And you mentioned the person who created the World Wrestling Federation. I think that it used to be called the WWF, didn't it? And they changed it because there was a legal case with the World Wildlife Fund. That's the history of that story. But what we're looking at with conspiracists like RFK Jr., running health or Medicare and Medicaid, and even the pick for Attorney General, whilst we were thrown a curveball with Matt Gaetz, that kind of settled itself, and he'll be working on Fox, I guess. I think he's doing cameo appearances right now. But the new pick, Pam Bondi, again, is a Trump lawyer. She effectively is like a personal lawyer to Donald Trump. She just speaks the language of Trumpism. And so forget separation of powers there. So what we're going to see is a completely new landscape for how this diktat is sent down to the states. Just talk to me about the instigation of this, because I kind of feel like I have two versions of this. He's either picking people purposely who are terrible to deconstruct the administrative state, as Bannon has talked about, or he genuinely thinks that these people are high quality. And because Pete Hegseth briefly served in the military and, he's on Fox, he's a perfect pick to run the military with $1 trillion budget. I mean, it makes no sense. Which of these paths is happening here? I mean, what is the reality? Because I'm struggling to make sense of it.
I'm going to answer this, and I promise it's going to be even more frustrating than the two that you gave me. The answer is both.
Right.
So one of the things that we have to do when we understand Donald Trump, because for a person to become president of the United States of America, I think there's a part of our brain that still tries to make them somewhat competent. Because how could you become president of the United States of America and not have some competence?
That's our projection, right?
Right, which is one of the reasons why our media is continuing to normalize him, right? We have to give him respect. He's the president of the United States of America, right? Give him a chance. The truth is that Donald Trump is a truly sick individual, an inept individual who is so lost in his own reality and so lost in his own narcissism and desperate yawning need. It's what he thinks. He probably looks at these candidates and thinks that they're the best possible people.
Yeah.
And why? Because they're sycophants. They're people who suck up to him, who are on the TV that he likes to watch. If this sounds stupid, it's stupid. But there's another part of this that people need to understand. When Donald Trump was elected in 2016, and again now in 2020, people have become more familiar with Project 2025, right? Like that's something that they've heard. They need to understand that every Republican president since Ronald Reagan is given a manual on how to be president by the Heritage Foundation that basically tells them who to appoint, what to carry out, all of that. They're not making these laws. They're not coming up with these priorities. They're given it. So more or less what's happening, and what I'm about to describe is horrific, but it is no less true. They'll say, okay, we're going to get to the Secretary of Defense. Who are you thinking about? And he's going to say, well, this Fox News host, he looks like a Secretary of Defense and he likes me. And the Heritage Foundation and all these associated oligarchical institutes, they then look at this guy and they say, is he going to play ball? Is he actually going to do what we want him to do? And in the case of people like Linda McMahon or any of these other inept ones, are they going to destroy the administrative state? That is the purpose. Use things like the Department of Defense or the Department of Justice as a weapon. Keep them strong, particularly with sycophants who can, follow orders. And for the rest of them, destroy them. I remind people, Rick Perry, who couldn't remember the Department of Energy in the debates, was then put in charge of the Department of Energy. Yeah. Why? Because they don't want it to work. They want to sabotage it. So it's a back and forth between Trump and his circle and places like the Heritage Foundation. And so it's both things all at once, all together.
Dr. Oz won 9 Emmys. So there's a reason to give him a job. And we shouldn't fail to mention bringing Elon Musk into the circle of trust as well. Not an official cabinet position, but to try and find $2 trillion to cut in public services. I mean, they're telling us that they are going to destroy all of the services, the public services that people rely on, and yet many of those people voted for this.
I want to make it incredibly clear what's happening with things like the Department of Government Efficiency, which I can't tell you how offended I am that one of the most devastating projects that we're going to see in our lifetimes is given a meme name and laughed about. It's disgusting.
Doge is it that you're talking about? There?
Doge.
Yeah.
We are literally going to watch the flatlining of the American standard of living. They're going to get rid of every social assistance program, including, and they're going to cut Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. You're going to see all these things bottomed out. The American dollar is going to be weakened in a pursuit of freeing capitalism and leaning into cryptocurrency, which is decentralized and also incredibly corrupt and useful for authoritarians. So basically, more or less, this is going to be a big giant bomb that they're going to let off within the American economy and government. The government efficiency panel is an absolute affront. It should be people's worst nightmare. And I keep advising people, and I would be remiss if I didn't say it here, get your affairs in order, understand what is going on, and prepare yourself for some real economic turmoil that these people are going to unleash. And shame on the Democrats who are showing that they could possibly support this. Shame on media members who say that Musk and Ramaswamy are somehow or another competent. 3, shame on anybody who says it's overdue and the administrative state needs to be cut. They are leading the way towards a big, giant, ugly project that is going to hurt people and honestly kill people in the long run.
And the price of eggs will just be a distant memory with what people are going to have to deal with.
Yeah, unfortunately. And you look at everything from tariffs to the economic warfare that's going to be put at the feet of the American people. It's going to be a period of suffering. I remain optimistic like you. I do think that in the end, we're going to have something better out of this. I think this is going to coalesce us and bring us together and give us purpose and something to fight against and fight toward. But I can't lie and say that this isn't going to be a time of tribulation. It's going to be very, very hard, and people need to prepare and be honest about it.
Some are saying that this might have been the last election we ever have. That once Donald Trump or the Heritage Foundation, the kind of MAGA Republican movement, install themselves in the White House and in all branches of government, including the Supreme Court, that they will never give the people a vehicle with which to remove them. Because why would they? Do you think that a fair vote will ever come our way again? Because already people are saying, oh, well, the midterms are only, not that many months away. And I'm thinking, I don't know that there are going to be midterms.
I've spent a lot of time in my work studying illiberal democracies, which is such an oxymoron, right? You look at Russia or Hungary, and basically you have an authoritarian movement that grasps the reins of power, and they basically move everything around. Like, there will be elections, but you don't trust them. Vladimir Putin comes in with like 97% of the vote. Meanwhile, what happens in all that, not only do they consolidate power, but also people lose hope. They become disillusioned, and they just say, you know what? Crack as many skulls as you want. Just leave me alone in my house. That's what I'm afraid of. I am afraid of this thing continuing to cycle, including the use of digital surveillance, the likes of which we've never seen before, misinformation and propaganda through the same channels you and I have talked about. I think we'll have midterms. I can't tell you right now whether or not those midterms will be handled fairly, or whether or not we'll even be in an environment that will actually reflect the will of the people. I don't know. But I do know that simply becoming nihilistic and thinking that none of it matters, dropping out and not paying attention or any of those things, that those only ensure that these terrible, terrible plans are going to be carried out. What authoritarians want is twofold. They want you to feel alone, and they want you to feel powerless. It's weaponized abuse is what it is. And you're supposed to say, you know what, I can't do anything about this. I'll go along with it. I won't rock the boat. Just don't hurt me. And that is what we've seen time and time again in these cycles.
And yet Trump hails Viktor Orban and Vladimir Putin. They're his referees. I mean, if he was applying for a job,
Yep.
These would be his references. Oh, well, Orban thinks I'm great. And we've heard him say that multiple times, especially on the campaign trail. Oh, well, Viktor Orban, he says that. And I was like, wow. And this is the problem, isn't it? When we aren't teaching not just civics, but world history.
Right.
Is the average American getting enough information about what is actually going on in Hungary? We had that propaganda interview with Tucker Carlson going to Russia and doing that very awkward interview with Putin, but because it didn't really work out, he then spent an extra couple of days going around grocery stores and train stations and saying, look how great it is here, and we could only dream to have this in America. I mean, that wasn't done by accident, was it?
No, it wasn't. And, to be personal for a second, a lot of people have been saying to me, like over the past few months and even the last year, they're like, how did you know the Republican Party was going to do this? How did you know that the MAGA movement was going to make these turns? And how did you predict all this? I didn't predict it. I listened to what they said.
Right.
The damnedest thing about this is they didn't hide any of this. It was right out in the open. All you had to do was read their blogs, read their posts, read their speeches, watch their videos. It was all telegraphed in every possible way. Viktor Orban, who I can't imagine most Americans actually know who he is. He had the Republicans basically out in almost like a student exchange program for years before CPAC came to Hungary, and then he came to CPAC. This international authoritarian movement and all of these little quizzlings around it, they've been very obvious about what they care about. They have been very obvious about what they have planned. They want to carry out what has happened in Russia and Hungary within the United States of America. Why do I know that? They told me. They said it. They've published it.
They wrote it down. Yeah.
The problem is that, going back to what we talked about, that pseudo environment, what our media gives us, what our politicians give us, none of this was talked about. It was within independent media. It was within a lot of podcasts and a lot of people like myself and yourself who said, hey, this is going on, but it didn't reach that larger cultural discourse. And that didn't feature into the election. That was never something that was actually talked about. It was missed despite the fact that all of this stuff was white out in the open in the clear sun.
Finally, I want to talk about a subject that has not just been omitted from this conversation, but was pretty much omitted from the election campaigns on both sides, and that is climate change. The existential threat that makes everything that we've been discussing null and void if we don't have a planet to actually live on and to trade on and to be successful on. Because we've been hearing in the last few days about the controversy going on at the latest COP, where it turns out that some of the texts were rewritten in favor of the energy companies. There's been whole kind of fake carbon capture movement, which doesn't really do anything. And all the while, the temperature of the planet is increasing. Quality of life for people is reducing. There will be a huge climate migration, which already started, but we'll start to see that over the next decade or two. And if you think the southern border in the US is bad now, it's going to be unrecognizable because there will be parts of this planet that are simply uninhabitable. If we look to Spain and we see those insane rains and floods and death on a massive scale, the war in Ukraine and Gaza and Yemen and Syria, they will pale into insignificance compared to this war on humanity from nature caused by us. And yet, Donald Trump plans to roll back pretty much all of the environmental protections that Biden has had some success with. And any change, what I want, and we've talked before about my plan, would be to employ the Defense Production Act and to blanket the country with solar panels. It's possible. Musk has admitted it. And yet all of that stuff is ancient history now. Just talk to this notion that climate change is actually a bigger threat than all of it.
You know, first of all, this is why you are one of the best in the business, is because, there are so many conversations about all of this that never touch on climate change. Make no bones about it. Everything that we've been talking about, rising authoritarianism, the rise of MAGA, the growing world war that we've been discussing, what's at the bottom of that? At the oligarchical power grab? It's climate change. It is one of the great drivers in all of what we're talking about right now. So I want to explain in the beginning, I think for a period, and I don't know if you were like this for a while, as I saw climate change up over the horizon and I read all the reports and all of the testimonies from people saying this was a problem, I was like, man, we're finally going to reach a point in which we realize that this is a problem and we're going to figure it out and it's going to do whatever. I don't think people understand denial and how strong denial is within humans. Like, you can be in a family where there's a problem, whether it's a drinking problem, a drug problem, a spending problem, or whatever, and it can be so obvious and it takes up so much energy to deny it, and then it pops up in other fights everywhere, right? Like squabbling and feuds and all of this. What we're actually doing right now in all of our politics and all of our culture is we are dealing with climate change by not dealing with it. We are living in denial of it. We are like trying to basically, more or less, it's like there's a cliff in the distance. We're hitting the gas on it now, because not only reindustrialization, which I brought up, is the exact wrong move to take care of climate change. Another world war would only escalate climate change and ensure things were going to happen like that. A far-right movement taking over the government and denying climate change is even a thing in the first place is not going to help it. The oligarchs who helped create the climate change crisis taking over is not going to help. The problem here is this. Climate change requires such a large-scale change in how we live that it's easier to deny it and dive into it, the actual crisis of it, than it is to take care of it. We have to change the way we live. We have to change the way we consume. We have to change the way our politics work, all of it. Instead, what have we done? You brought up climate refugees. I invite people to remember what happened to refugees from the global south when they came to America under Donald Trump's regime, and even during some Democrats. They were put in cages. They were forcibly sterilized. Some people have died in all of that. I mean, many people have died in all of this. If you think that was bad, add in diminishing resources and diminishing real estate and land, it's going to get worse. And it's going to happen as states start going underwater and as wildfires happen and droughts happen and people move. We talked about the red versus blue states and like the statification in the United States. Like, if we don't get this under control, and by this I mean right-wing authoritarianism and the capitulation among liberals, moderates, you name it. If we don't get that under control and create a process that gives people hope and purpose and a direction forward that also addresses climate change, it's over. I don't think that this is a fatalistic account. It's talking about reality as it is, but unless we start to marshal something that changes things, it's done. And that means that we have to do that. You have to find a different way that actually changes the way things work at this point.
Do you think that existential threats like climate change are just too much for some humans to intellectualize? And therefore, it's almost impossible to do anything. I mean, you've alluded to this, but it's almost impossible as individuals, especially in America, where the concept of collective responsibility is pretty low down on the list. If you look to other nations, Scandinavian countries, for example, they totally get this kind of social democracy and the concept of everybody doing their bit and playing their part. But it's, imagine going to Texas and telling people that this is what you need to do to save humanity. It's just not going to wash. And so America really, as the second biggest polluter on the planet after China, is really the wrong country to lead the charge on climate change.
It certainly is, for a variety of reasons. And I want to point something out, which is the problem of climate change started with the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution not just begat climate change, it begat the administrative state. And in both cases, you have problems, entities that are so large that an individual has a hard time wrapping their mind around it. It's like thinking about space for too long and your brain shuts down, right? So what do we do with it? We break it down into little rituals. So I'm going to say something that I need to give context, but I think it will help people understand. I do recycle, but I don't recycle thinking that it's going to stop climate change. Right? I'm not one of the main drivers of climate change. My usage of materials doesn't drive climate change. Doesn't help, right? But like, I'm trying to do my own part. It's the equivalent of recycling and thinking that I took care of climate change, and as a result, it's beyond me. Same thing with the administrative state. The feeling that I voted, that's all I could do. That's it, right? Like, that's over there and it's beyond my control. Thinking about how to change geopolitics and this larger machine that has created it, it shuts us off if we don't break it down into workable parts, right? Which is, I can do this, I can then do this, I can then do this, I can do this, which includes organizing, creating coalitions, creating political movements, also advocating for reform and change, and also things that will take care of climate change. If we try and do it all at once, it's impossible. I can't make China change. I don't live in China. I don't know anybody. Well, I know a couple people in China, but I can't force China to abandon its current status. I can't force America just by, my will alone to change the way that it operates. I can't change the military industrial complex or the processing of goods, but I can make steps along the way that can do it. Otherwise, the mind shuts down. It repels away from it. It's so large.
And people haven't really understood what Joe Biden talked about with this, this Green New Deal, which were words he couldn't actually say because they were too political. But the fact that good jobs can come from a green economy, and that, my idea of employing the Defense Production Act, where you literally put the nation to work, harnessing the power of the sun. I mean, it's not difficult, and China has the technology to do it. That's the crazy thing, is that they're so far ahead. I mean, they're switching out batteries on electric cars in under a minute in these charge stations, where the batteries are the things that are being changed, rather than you standing there for 45 minutes waiting to get a top-up. I mean, the technology exists. There is value there. There is wealth there. And yet there is still this denial that we should be drilling baby drill, and that all of the resources are under our feet, and there's enough oil and there's enough of this fossil fuel to last decades.
Yeah, I want to give some advice to people who are listening, and maybe even some Democratic politicians who might be watching or listening.
Yeah.
We want the world to work like West Wing. We want to think that a speech that talks about our highest values and a call to principles is what's going to change people's minds. We are a selfish country. If the 2024 presidential election didn't show that, people voted for Donald Trump because they thought that he would get them jobs and help them economically, and then voted to give themselves reproductive rights at the same time, right? It's a very self-interested thing. I lived in Indiana for much of my life. And you know what? It was almost like the biggest sin in the world to drive a foreign car in Indiana. You know when that changed? When a Toyota plant came to Indiana. And you started seeing them all over the place. You started seeing a lot of people start driving hybrids and Toyota Priuses, right? If you want to sell something like the Green New Deal, or something that helps climate change, you can't say, hey, we're doing this for the earth. We're doing it to do our part. That's something that speaks of sacrifice. I have to do without for that. You have to go ahead and say, hey, guess what? In Ohio, where we have no hope of winning an electoral vote from now or forever, guess what, Youngstown, Ohio? You are now going to become one of the biggest manufacturers of solar panels or wind turbines. And I guarantee you start giving those jobs and you start basing communities around that. You start carrying out projects that give places that don't have any hope or direction. You start giving them those contracts and those jobs and purposes. I guarantee you they're going to become eco-warriors. Right? In the same way that, what do people care about in Iowa? They care about corn being used in fuel, right? Like it's the material conditions that need to be addressed, and that selfishness does need to be put in it. Again, the New Deal showed us that. Civilian Conservation Corps bought off fascists from joining fascist movements. That's the way we need to approach this thing, and the Democrats need to give up on a lot of these lofty speeches in favor of actually answering material conditions.
I knew you'd have a solution. I knew you'd be the right person to ask. We have to finish, but for now, Jared Yates Sexton, thank you for joining The Weekend Show.
My pleasure.
I'm Anthony Davis. Don't forget to support me and independent journalism at patreon.com/5Minute News. You can see more from me on the 5 Minute News YouTube channel and podcast. And I'll come back next Sunday with a brand new special guest and more factual news to discuss on the 5 Minute News Weekend Show with Midas Touch.